London, 1863. Clubs are arguing. Some want to kick, some want to carry, and others want to keep kicking each other's shins. One man, Ebenezer Cobb Morley, writes down a set of laws the FA formed in 1863 that changed the game forever. Across the ocean, Walter Camp is busy reshaping rugby into something uniquely American, formalizing the scoring system that made touchdowns central, while inventing the line of scrimmage, the down system, and the quarterback role. Two men, different continents, similar vision, to turn chaos into structure. One made the world's most watched sport, the other helped build the world's richest league. What they created wasn't just sport, it was industry. And to understand how they pulled it off, we first need to see why football once looked more like a threat than a game. Why did a game so popular with ordinary people end up on the wrong side of kings and lawmakers? In the Middle Ages, what passed for football bore little resemblance to the sport we know today. Crowds swarmed the streets, chasing after a ball with no defined teams, no boundaries, and no officials to keep order. There were no referees, no timekeepers, and certainly no attention to safety. Instead, it was a moving riot in which the larger the crowd, the greater the destruction. This early version, fittingly known as mob football, involved entire communities. Villages would shut down for the occasion, shops closed, markets disrupted, and streets turned into battlegrounds. The game wasn't just about chasing a ball, it was about energy spilling into violence. Players collided with buildings, wagons were overturned, and the unlucky bystanders sometimes paid the price with broken windows and damaged property. Injuries weren't occasional, they were expected. Fractured legs, smashed teeth, concussions, these weren't rare accidents but almost a built-in part of the spectacle. Authorities were less than impressed, to city leaders and monarchs. Mob football wasn't a festival, it was a menace. In one of the earliest documented crackdowns, London officials issued a decree in 1314 banning gatherings to play the game, citing the chaos and violence it caused across the city. By the reign of Edward III, pressure intensified. In 1363, he issued a proclamation specifically listing football among forbidden pastimes. The concern wasn't only destruction and disorder. Rulers feared football lured men away from practicing archery, a skill viewed as essential for national defense. In other words, the crown saw unruly ball games as a threat to both public order and military readiness. What did these matches look like? Imagine villages locked in what felt less like a contest and more like a street-wide struggle. Instead of pitches, everyday landmarks served as goals. Perhaps a church on one end and a tavern on the other. The game moved through alleys, squares, and fields without restraint. Tempers often flared as much between players as over possession of the ball, and with no standard rules to appeal to, disputes escalated into fistfights or worse. Summed up simply, it looked less like sport, more like chaos and motion. And yet, despite royal frowns and prohibitions, the games didn't vanish. The medieval crowd's passion for play was undeniable. Even when suppressed, the energy returned again and again, shaping customs and local traditions. What the bans actually did was highlight just how irresistible football had become. Attempts to stifle it didn't erase it. Instead, they pushed the game to adapt, to find other places where it could be played in relative safety. Without structure, mob football couldn't be more than a seasonal outlet, always lurking on the edge of legality. But the raw desire to chase, to kick, to compete, that never disappeared. The bans exposed the truth rulers failed to appreciate. People were willing to risk punishment just to play. And in time, that persistence meant the game migrated to settings where order and schedules already reigned. Taken off the streets, football didn't die. It took on a new shape. In fact, it was in its exile that the sport started to change character. No longer defined only by riotous mobs, it began to move into environments where some form of structure and experimentation was possible. That shift would turn out to be decisive. Outlawed in villages and towns, the game survived, but it found a new laboratory: elite schools. That shift is where organized rules begin. What if I told you the transformation of a rough street game into organized football didn't unfold in city squares or pubs, but behind the gates of England's most prestigious public schools? These institutions, elite boarding schools like Rugby, Eton, and Harrow, became unlikely laboratories where chaos started to take form. Within their walls, students inherited the wild spirit of mob football, but tried to control it. Schedules, discipline, and traditions already defined school life, and when those same boys played football, they found themselves needing rules simply to keep matches manageable. Football wasn't about lofty ideals yet, it was about making sure the game could even continue past the first argument. By the early 1800s, each major school had its own recognizable version of football. At some, like rugby, carrying the ball was embraced. At others, like Eton, dribbling and kicking were central. Matches reflected local identity as much as raw athleticism. Unlike the fluid mob football that spilled across streets and villages, these school games usually played out within courtyards or fields bordered by walls, hedges, or stone. That physical constraint forced rethinking. Students couldn't tear through towns and topple carts anymore. They had to work within limits. Structure became unavoidable. But structure also made the differences between schools starker. The boundaries were in place, yet the rules were not. And when one school's boys faced another's, an immediate dilemma cropped up. Whose rulebook should they follow? What happened when one school allowed handling while the other absolutely prohibited it? Games risked falling apart in frustration. To hold matches at all, schools sometimes split matches in half, each side taking turns to play under home rules in one half and visitor rules in the other. It wasn't elegant, but it showed just how desperately the game needed a single framework. Some institutions were faster to codify than others. Eton had an early set of guidelines in 1815, while Aldenham produced theirs in 1825. But the landmark moment came in 1845, when Rugby School tasked 3 boys with writing down formal rules for the first time. Those rules authorized running with the ball and tackling, seeding what would grow into rugby. You've probably heard the tale of William Webb Ellis inventing rugby by picking up the ball and running with it in the 1820s. Historians mostly dismiss it as a myth, but it shows how contested the game's origins became, inspiring legends that still linger today. What mattered more than the story was the reality. Once rules were written, the game gained identity and permanence. Not all schools lean that way. At Cambridge, students pieced together their own rules in 1863, deliberately banning rugby-style carrying and emphasizing kicking and dribbling. Those Cambridge rules laid the groundwork for what became association football. Together, rugby's 1845 code and Cambridge's 1863 code revealed the split at the heart of football. Was it supposed to showcase skill with the feet or toughness with the body? Handling versus dribbling, that was the essential divide. Other disputes piled onto this central one. The question of offside divided opinion. Was it unfair for a striker to linger near the goal, hoping for an easy pass? One camp argued it ruined balance, while another saw clever opportunity. Ball handling itself ignited similar disputes. Should using hands be called cheating, or was it just creative play? Layered on top of this was hacking, the sanctioned shin kicking that some schools insisted was the very definition of football. For defenders of hacking, toughness wasn't a regrettable side effect, it was the soul of the game. F.M. Campbell of Blackheath would even later declare, hacking is the true football. For others, hacking was simply violence, something to be cut away if football was ever to be more than bruises and broken bones. These divisions weren't just semantic, they created enclosed worlds of football that often refused to mix. Each school fiercely believed its code was authentic. Inter-school matches could stall in disputes, and even when played in 2 halves with alternating rule sets, the games didn't truly resolve anything. Instead, they spotlighted the impossibility of growth without uniformity. With Britain's expanding railway system making inter-school travel easier, the problem became sharper. Schools could now meet and compete more often, but they lacked the shared language of the game. Passion alone couldn't bridge rules that sometimes contradicted each other outright. As former students left these schools and founded clubs in industrial towns, they carried their preferred versions with them. Working-class players soon faced the same stumbling block. Imagine trying to schedule a match if one club insisted that carrying the ball was fundamental, while the other called it cheating. Think of another club enforcing strict offside, while their opponents rejected it entirely. Early clubs reflected the school traditions that birthed them, but with no alignment, football outside the schools ran into the same walls of incompatibility. The result was a double-edged legacy. Public schools gave football structure, discipline, and written rules, an essential foundation that mob football never had. But they also introduced rivalry and fragmentation, with rugby formalizing one branch and Cambridge charting another. The seeds of both rugby and soccer were firmly planted, but no national game could thrive on such division. Something had to change. By the mid-1800s, the game stood at a crossroads. Organized matches existed, passion was undeniable, but football was still fractured, split between rough carrying codes and dribbling codes, without a unifying authority to bring them together. The potential for something bigger was obvious, but the constant disagreements over rules left the game fragile, at risk of collapse into stubborn silos. That deadlock set the stage for one decisive intervention. It would take someone outside the insular world of the schools to cut through the disputes, establish a rulebook, and give the sport a common foundation. And with that step, football could finally move from fragmented experiments to an organized system powerful enough to grow into an industry. Imagine writing down a set of rules that quietly launched one of the world's biggest businesses. That's exactly what one man would attempt in the 1860s. Ebenezer Cobb Morley stepped forward at the exact moment football needed structure. A London lawyer by trade, Morley was used to dissecting details and drafting agreements, a mindset that translated perfectly into the messy, fragmented world of football in the 1860s. He wasn't a player of legend or a wealthy backer. Instead, he was someone who understood frameworks and organization, in a sport that had been shaped by argument and improvisation that made him uniquely valuable. His entry point came in 1862 when he founded Barnes Football Club, one of the earliest clubs outside of the elite school system. Barnes wasn't a powerhouse by reputation, but its creation showed football spilling beyond school walls into wider society. The problem quickly became obvious. Clubs couldn't agree on how to play. Some leaned toward the dribbling game inspired by Cambridge, others stuck with rugby's carrying traditions. Every match risked grinding to a halt in disputes. For Morley, the lawyer who thrived on clarity, this chaos was unacceptable. By October 1863, Morley gathered clubs together at the Freemasons Tavern in London. This became the first meeting of the Football Association, a decisive step toward unifying the sport. He was elected the FA's first secretary, giving him both responsibility and influence. Morley didn't treat the role as honorary. He used his position to push a written rule set, and the clubs that adopted it gained a competitive advantage in organizing fixtures and attracting spectators. Within weeks, he submitted a draft of what became the laws of the game, published in December that year. For the first time, English football had an official rulebook. Arguments could now be settled by reference to a common standard. Standardization may sound administrative, but it sparked transformation. Suddenly, any club across England could play under the same code and face opponents fairly. This created the foundation for scaling football beyond local rivalries. In business terms, Morley had created something like a franchise model, one rulebook that anyone could adopt and replicate. By standardizing rules, Morley created a repeatable product that clubs could market and fans could follow, the first step toward leagues, competitions, and paying crowds. But this leap came with friction. Clubs rooted in rugby-style play saw the FA's decisions as an attack on football's identity. The fiercest debates focused on two issues: hacking, shin-kicking, and carrying the ball. For many traditionalists, these were the essence of the game. To remove them stripped football of toughness and authenticity. The tipping point came when the FA voted to ban both. Several clubs walked away in protest. Blackheath famously withdrew, claiming the code had been gutted of its spirit. Losing clubs was a serious challenge, threatening to split football into rival camps. The FA could have withered, while rougher codes thrived on their own. But Morley's standardized version offered clear advantages. Clubs that followed the FA laws found it easier to arrange fixtures, draw consistent crowds, and maintain order on the pitch. As more teams gravitated toward predictability and away from chaos, the FA's influence spread. What began as a fragile experiment soon tilted into dominance. Within a decade, association football had outpaced the alternatives and emerged as the most sustainable model in England. Morley's achievement went beyond simple codification. By writing rules that any club could adopt, he created not just coherence, but governance. For the first time, football could be managed, scaled, and exported. What began in one London tavern expanded into a national network. Later, when FIFA formed in 1904, it rested on the very same framework. Without Morley, there would be no single global game, only scattered, incompatible versions. His background explains much of his success. As a lawyer, Morley was trained to see rules not as constraints but as enablers. Contracts allow trade, laws allow courts to function. Football's laws allowed a pastime to become an organized sport. Like CEOs who set standards in technology or industry, Morley treated football's rules as the infrastructure needed for growth. Once those standards existed, the sport could finally attract attention, investment, and spectators on a scale mob football never could. This is why his role is often compared to that of a business founder. He wasn't just another enthusiast pushing to play. He was building systems. He acted less like a hobbyist and more like a leader, setting terms of operation. The banning of hacking, controversial though it was, created space for skill to shine over brute violence. The emphasis on kicking opened the door to strategy, competition, and eventually the artistry celebrated worldwide. Morley may not have called himself an entrepreneur, but his actions creating uniform rules, driving consensus, and embedding governance made him football's first CEO in spirit. The Laws of the Game, published in December 1863, remain his lasting contribution. Adjusted and refined over time, they still form the backbone of global football today. Millions of matches from local parks to the World Cup trace their legitimacy back to the framework Morley pushed through. That one act of codification silently launched the sport's global industry. Yet while football in England found stability through standardization, a different experiment was underway across the Atlantic. Their traditions weren't being unified, they were being reinvented. And at the center of that transformation stood another figure, who, like Morley, saw structure, not as restriction, but as opportunity. Why is Walter Camp remembered as the father of American football? To answer that, you have to imagine the uncertain state of college sports in the late 1860s. Young men at places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Rutgers were playing games, yet no one could agree on what the game actually was. Rules varied week by week, sometimes even match by match. One group would insist the ball could only be kicked. The next insisted you could grab it and run. Players were left improvising, fans were often confused, and colleges lacked a sport with a clear identity. The very first intercollegiate match, Rutgers versus Princeton on 6 November 1869, reflected this confusion. That game played under rules closer to soccer. The ball couldn't be carried, and kicking dominated the action. Just a few years later, things shifted again. In May 1874, Harvard hosted McGill University from Canada, and those visitors played by rugby rules. Suddenly, carrying, tackling, and scrums entered the American college scene. Harvard was impressed and adopted this version. Step by step, the game was pulled away from soccer and toward rugby. Colleges now had taste of a rougher, more physical contest, but the problem hadn't gone away. It still wasn't truly one sport. Depending on who took the field, football looked completely different. That fragmentation created pressure. Colleges wanted rituals, rivalries, and meaningful traditions they could rally alumni around. Spectators wanted matches they could follow without needing a lecture on rules every week. America in the late 1800s already valued structure and invention. For a sport to thrive on campuses, it had to offer both excitement and consistency. What it needed was a framework. Enter Walter Camp at Yale. Born in Connecticut in 1859, Camp played halfback at Yale and captained the team from 1876 to 1882. He wasn't satisfied with chaos. He studied the game the way an engineer studies blueprints. While others were content with endless scrums, he saw a chance to redesign the product. Camp didn't just want to play, he wanted a system that scaled, one that any college could adopt and spectators could immediately understand. He acted like a product designer, taking a chaotic prototype and shaping it into something that felt finished, marketable, and eventually TV-friendly. His most revolutionary change came in 1880, when he proposed replacing continuous scrums with a brand new idea, the line of scrimmage. Each play would now begin with the ball snapped back to start the action. This gave football something rugby never had: clarity. Instead of a long, muddled fight for the ball, every play reset the contest with a fresh burst of action. It created rhythm, suspense, and a clear narrative for fans. Here comes the snap, here's the play, now let's see what happens next. But Camp didn't stop with scrimmage lines. That same year, he introduced the down and distance system. Teams were required to move the ball forward a set distance within a limited number of attempts. Fail and possession turned over. This injected urgency. Suddenly, football became a contest of planning and execution, not just brute force. Too cautious, you'd run out of downs. Too reckless, the defense would stop you cold. Strategy became inseparable from physical play. Camp layered more elements on top. He standardized teams at 11 players aside, smaller and tighter than rugby's 15. He formalized the role of the quarterback, who would take the snap and orchestrate the attack. Interference, penalties, and even the safety became part of his blueprint. What he was sketching was not just a game but an architecture, a repeatable system others could trust. And note, one thing he didn't invent was the forward pass. That rule change came later in 1906 as part of reforms meant to make football safer. Camp's contribution was about making the game coherent and strategic first. Think of what he accomplished. Before Camp, American football looked like an improvised hobby split between soccer and rugby. After Camp, it had rules that every college could follow. It had structure for audiences to enjoy. Coaches could scheme, fans could place their loyalty in a recognizable format, and universities could rally around standardized contests. What had been disorganized was now functional. Camp had transformed an experiment into an adoptable product, yet his reforms weren't embraced without dissent. Many traditionalists clung to rugby's free-flowing scrums and physical chaos. To them, Camp's stop-start system felt artificial, almost engineered rather than natural. They worried the beauty of constant struggle was being stripped away. Debate after debate played out in the Intercollegiate Football Association's rules meetings. Camp had to argue tirelessly that his ideas made the game not only safer and clearer, but compelling for crowds. His persistence won out, though not overnight. Slowly, universities began to see the advantages. The line of scrimmage gave order to contests. The down system created urgency. The quarterback role provided a visible leader for fans to recognize and follow. Together, these innovations turned messy matches into dramatic spectacles. Colleges sensed the appeal. Alumni could stake pride on a game that felt distinctly American, not just borrowed from England or Canada. By the 1880s and 1890s, schools across the country were embracing Camp's model. Football was finally uniting under one code, and with it came explosive growth. Rivalries flourished, stadium crowds swelled, and strategies deepened as masterminds experimented within Camp's structure. By the 1890s, Yale was dominating under his guidance, compiling extraordinary records such as 67 wins and only 2 losses between 1888 and 1892. His influence was not only on the rulebook but on the field as a winning coach. The blueprint he designed held firm, and his authoritative role gave American football a national identity distinct from both rugby and soccer. The long-term effects were even greater. Camp's system laid the foundation for professional football, even though the NFL wouldn't be founded until 1920. Every major feature of today's game, the scrimmage, downs, 11-man teams, the quarterback can be traced to Camp's rule changes. His version of football was strategic, structured, and adaptable for mass audiences. Without him, there's every chance American football might have remained just another eccentric branch of rugby. Ebenezer Cobb Morley set football on a global path in England, and Walter Camp reshaped it for American tastes. From one tangled origin in the streets of Europe, 2 streamlined visions emerged. And that sets up a pivotal question. What happened when these 2 approaches, one built around clean kicking, the other around structured set plays, started to define entire sporting empires? How did one game, born from the same chaotic roots, fracture into 2 very different sporting empires? The dividing line came from how England and America each decided what football should be. In England, Ebenezer Cobb Morley's association football put all emphasis on kicking, teamwork, and flowing play, stripped of hacking and rough collisions. Across the Atlantic, Walter Camp's reinvention shaped a version built on structure, set pieces, and defined positions like the quarterback. These weren't minor tweaks, they were philosophical breaks that produced 2 sports strong enough to stand on their own. Association football flourished in England because standardization made it accessible. Once the Football Association settled on common rules, clubs across towns and cities could compete without endless disputes. Matches became cleaner, easier to follow, and more appealing to the growing number of spectators. What had once been village contests defined by mobs and violence turned into a dependable product. A sport that used feet, rewarded passing, and minimized stops in play. Just as important, it could scale. Clubs in Manchester and London could face each other on equal terms, and when the rules traveled abroad with sailors and merchants, they instantly made sense. Morley's blueprint offered simplicity and openness, qualities that allowed the game to speed toward global reach. In America, the pole went in a different direction. Walter Camp didn't aim for simplicity, he aimed for precision. By introducing the line of scrimmage and the down system, he made every play resemble a planned set piece. The quarterback role turned one player into the visible leader of strategy, giving spectators a narrative anchor. Rugby's endless scrum was replaced with stop-start plays that injected drama into every possession. For American audiences, the value wasn't in uninterrupted flow, but in the anticipation of moments. The snap, the pass, the touchdown run. Football wasn't constant motion, it was controlled bursts of competition that invited both strategy and spectacle. To US tastes, this didn't feel restrictive, it felt engineered for drama. Neither model canceled the other out. Association football spread with industrial clubs across Britain and Europe, taking root wherever workers needed a pastime. It leapt oceans, finding soil in South America, Asia, and Africa, becoming the language of entire continents. Camp's version, meanwhile, stayed anchored in US colleges, where football quickly became tied to identity, alumni pride, and the culture of organized competition. What Morley standardized for the world, Camp re-engineered for one nation, and both visions proved sustainable. The key milestones show how these philosophies scaled into industries. In 1871, just a few years after Morley's effort to codify rules, the FA Cup was organized, with the first season played in 1871-72. This national knockout competition gave clubs something beyond casual fixtures, an annual contest with mass appeal that laid the foundation for league structures and professionalization. Nearly 50 years later, in 1920, professional American teams formed the American Professional Football Association, soon renamed the NFL. Just as the FA Cup turned association football into a repeatable national pastime, the NFL created a professional structure that transformed college traditions into a commercial league. Both milestones marked the moment these sports stopped being loose movements and started operating like industries. Think of it as 2 rival platforms built from the same prototype. Association football became the universal product, fast, open, and easy to pick up, played in backyards as much as stadiums. American football evolved into a complex system, scripted plays, high stakes, and perfect for showcasing in an arena. The result wasn't one winner and one loser, it was two models, each tuned to its market environment. The business contrast makes the split even clearer. Association football built its empire on global scale. Today, it is played by more than 250 million people worldwide, and FIFA's World Cup is the single most watched event on the planet. By contrast, American football concentrated power inside one market. The NFL engineered its league for television breaks, advertising opportunities, and stadium-sized drama. Its payoff is undeniable. The NFL boasts the highest average attendance of any professional sports league in the world, at 67,591 per game, and the Super Bowl dominates US television ratings year after year. So here's the sharp divide. Association football became the shared game of humanity, spreading across continents and cultures, scaling its reach through global networks. The NFL became America's most profitable entertainment machine, extracting immense value from one concentrated audience through spectacle and branding. Scale versus concentration, global penetration versus national monetization. Two different business frameworks, but both wildly successful. The split ensured that one sport could unite scattered villages in Africa, barrios in South America, and playgrounds in Europe with nothing more than a ball, while the other could pack vast US stadiums and generate billions through broadcast rights. One became the most played and recognized sport in the world. The other became the richest single sports league on earth. Neither model looks anything like mob football, but both can trace their DNA back to the same unruly ancestor. And that brings us to the deeper question. It wasn't inevitable that rulebooks became multi-billion-dollar systems. Something in Morley and Camp's leadership pushed their visions beyond arguments into lasting industries. What qualities allowed one lawyer in London and one student in Connecticut to turn experiments into empires? That's the real key to understanding their impact. Morley and Camp weren't simply men with a passion for football. They were entrepreneurs who treated rough games as unfinished products. Each one drew on a different playbook. Morley the unifier, turning fragmented traditions into a single standard that could expand outward, and Camp the innovator, reshaping a half-defined sport into something dramatically new. Their approaches may have diverged, but together they reveal how leadership transforms pastimes into industries. Morley's strength was codification. He didn't invent dazzling plays or overhaul how the game looked on the field. What he did was remove uncertainty. His draft laws, adopted by the Football Association, gave every club in England the same vocabulary of rules. That clarity allowed ordinary fixtures to grow into leagues, and leagues into a national competition like the FA Cup. Without a framework, football would have remained a handful of incompatible versions, but Morley's insistence on one code allowed it to spread with speed and predictability. What does that look like for a sports entrepreneur today? Codification means global rules and centralized governance. For example, FIFA's unified laws make it possible to sell international broadcasting rights that ensure viewers in Tokyo, Rio, or London all understand the same game. That standardization isn't just about sport, it's a product that scales across borders. Camp's strength was different. Where Morley unified, Camp differentiated. He looked at rugby-style contests that dragged on with endless scrums and saw the chance to build something sharper, theatrically structured and tension-filled. His line of scrimmage forced each play to reset. His system of downs demanded progress. His invention of a quarterback role turned one man into a narrative focal point. He didn't compromise between rugby and soccer. He engineered a new product. So what does that look like in today's sports business? Innovation means designing experiences that maximize spectacle and monetization. Think of the NFL's stop-start rhythm. Every pause and play is predictable, which makes it perfect for TV ad slots and digital engagement. Those engineered breaks created one of the most reliable streams of advertising inventory in media. That isn't coincidence. It's innovation serving marketability. Neither path was easy. Morley faced clubs like Blackheath that refused to abandon rough play and withdrew from the FA. He bet on order and consistency at the risk of shrinking his movement. Camp argued through committees where traditionalists accused him of overcomplicating a simple game. He risked alienating those who wanted rugby's chaos preserved. Both men had no guarantee of authority. They relied on conviction, persuading peers that their version was not only viable, but expandable. That mirrors every startup founder's reality. Ideas survive only if adoption proves them right. The dual lesson is practical. Codification builds scale. Innovation builds demand. Without unified governance, a sport cannot grow across communities, let alone continents. Without reinvention, it stagnates and loses relevance. Morley guaranteed that anyone could play the same football, and that football could cross oceans. Camp guaranteed that American football would be gripping, structured, and uniquely marketable to its audience. Here's another way to apply it. Imagine you're launching a new sports league or entertainment format today. First, codification. You need rules that travel. Without them, you can't sell international media packages or secure sponsorships, because no two audiences would recognize the same product. Then innovation. You need to craft moments that hook fans. Without new forms of spectacle or interaction, even standardized games won't capture attention in a market saturated with options. The same forces driving Morley and Camp's success still run sports business today. The sports sponsorship market alone is projected to reach around $115 billion by 2025 and could surpass $160 billion by 2030. That growth leans on both codification and innovation at a commercial level. Codification, like FIFA's global governance, keeps rights packages reliable and valuable. Innovation, like hyper-personalized digital ads built into NFL broadcasts or real-time fan data experiments, keeps audiences engaged in ways that justify the spending. You can already see Morley's principle in how leagues standardize fan data. Centralized systems, sometimes using secure data clean rooms, allow leagues to present sponsors with aggregated insights across millions of fans. That structure reassures investors and advertisers in the same way Morley's laws reassured football clubs. Without governance, the system fragments. On the other side, you can see Camp's principle in how leagues compete for younger audiences. Fans under 34 are 1.4 times more likely to attend live sports, and they demand fast, interactive formats. That's why sports experiment with shorter competitions, mobile betting tie-ins, or interactive viewing through apps and social media. Just as Camp's line of scrimmage engineered more drama, today's digital innovations engineer more touchpoints with fans. The duality explains why both men remain relevant. Morley shows how governance and standardization scale an idea past its roots. Camp shows how a product redesigned for drama and clarity captivates an audience. One without the other fails. Codification without innovation locks a sport in rigid tradition. Innovation without codification produces chaos that can't endure. Taken together, their entrepreneurial playbooks explain not just how football evolved, but how every successful league today grows. Global replication relies on standards. Market attraction relies on reinvention. That's the bond running from 1863 London taverns to NFL Super Bowl ads and FIFA sponsorship deals. Growth comes when rules provide scale, and innovation creates demand. Which side are you betting on? Standardization or innovation? Tell us in the comments. Because when you reflect on it, sports didn't just inherit passion from street games and schoolyard traditions. They became industries because two men treated leadership like entrepreneurship, proving that games could be governed, packaged, and sold. Football didn't have one inventor, it had two architects who unknowingly built parallel industries. Morley gave the world a standardized framework, and Camp created a tactical spectacle that defined America. Both sought order from chaos, yet each solution grew into a cultural powerhouse. Their rulebooks didn't just make games possible, they created industries that today generate tens of billions in annual value. So here's the question: which rule changed today? Whether a new format, a safety rule, or even an AI-driven stat could create the next big league? Drop your idea in the comments. If you like this breakdown of how rules build industries, subscribe for more sports business case studies.